So my video on signs of emotionally abusive parents has gotten a lot of attention lately, which I found very peculiar, but then when thinking about it, it made sense. Right now we're living through a pandemic, and many children, students, adults have gone on furlough, have returned, or are spending much more time with their emotionally abusive parents or the toxic environment they were in. And I think that kids, students, again, adults are becoming much more aware of this. They're becoming much more, they're despairing much more over this. So I want to do a second video where I go a little bit more in depth on signs of emotionally abusive parents. But stick with me to the end of this video, because I really want to emphasize how these emotionally abusive traits of your parents are transferred to your future relationships, and most likely, unfortunately, twisted your romantic relationships. So yeah, if you have no idea who I am, my name is Olympia. With my studies in cognitive neuroscience and art history, what I like to do, I like to dissect that pretty little brain of yours to see what makes you tick, but also what makes you talk. So if you haven't already, make sure to smash that subscribe button and ring that bell for your weekly Thursday videos. So let's start. So the thing with emotional abuse, I say this a lot in my videos, is that there are no scars, there are no bruises, there are no cuts, there's nothing that you can really show to another person that you're being abused, or even validate the fact that you are being abused, make you feel that you're right, because it's all in here. And which is one of the reasons why I believe emotional abuse took so long to be recognized, to be coined, and even right now we're still coming up with new terms and new terminologies of types of emotional abuse, such as negging, gaslighting, all of which I've done videos on. I'll link them below. So a few signs of emotionally abusive parents is sign number one. Their emotions are really heightened, or they have really rapid mood swings. So you grow up in a household where you feel like you're walking on eggshells, like the slightest thing can tick your parent off, that they can become either very angry, very depressed, very anxious. And the thing with emotionally abusive parents is that sometimes the child skips this developmental stage where they can freely express their emotions. They can understand what emotions they are feeling, and they can identify them, because suddenly all the attention is given to the parent and not upsetting the parent. The second sign of emotionally abusive parents is what I like to call the blame game. So instead of the parent expressing their feelings, they say sentences. Instead of saying I feel, they say you make me feel. So for example, your behavior is making me feel sad. Your behavior is making me feel neglected. And they will either blame the child, or sometimes worse, their partner. And I'll explain why I mean that this is worse. When you're blaming the partner, you're kind of forming an alliance with the child against the partner. Because when the child is so young, they're not really able to understand the emotional complexity between a partnership, a relationship, a marriage. And by making the partner seem like the bad cop, immediately that child will form a relationship, especially if they're spending a lot of time with that parent, hating the other parent. And usually parents like this are labeled as narcissists, codependent, because they rely on their child in order to verify and validate their feelings and point about their spouse. So for example, if their spouse is being neglectful, if they're not being caring, if they are being violent, they will tell that to the child will recognize this, will see this, and immediately they will feed into the emotions of the parent. So suddenly the parent has a little sidekick next to them. And this is a sign of emotional abuse, because the child hasn't been able to develop their own opinion. They're not on neutral ground. So the child is held accountable for whatever the feelings of the parent is. Whether the parent feels depressed, anxious, angry, happy, the child is responsible for that feeling. So if the child changes its behavior and makes the parent unhappy, the parent will make sure that the child knows that they have caused that behavior, they have caused that feeling, and then the child feels, of course, responsible for it. Another sign of emotionally abusive parents is that they seek validation. This is part of the blame game I was talking about, through their children. And this doesn't have to do with the partner, this has to do with the parent themselves. I've talked a lot about parentification, and how basically parentification is when the child takes on the role of the parent and the roles are reversed. So the child is asked to grow up and become more wise and mature much faster than they should, and they don't really have a chance to be a child. And so this ties into the validation part, in the sense that the parent will talk negatively about themselves. They will say, I'm not pretty enough, I'm not skinny enough, I'm too fat, I'm not making enough money, I'm not a good enough mother, I'm not a good enough wife. And the child feels responsible for making the parent feel better. So they have to come up with either solutions, or they have to be the parent's psychologist and therapist and listen to all the parents' problems and try and fix them. Another sign of emotionally abusive parents, which is much more direct, is when you're overly criticizing, withholding compliments for a child. Now, of course, parents are not perfect, children are not perfect. Usually most parents think that their children walk on water and they can do no wrong, but usually parents that have been emotionally abused will pass it on to their children and will do the same thing. So they will be very critical of their decisions. No matter what achievement the child has done, they will always think that there is room for improvement. So if a child comes in second, let's say in tennis, the parent, instead of saying, congratulations, that's amazing, like you came in second, will be like, okay, why didn't you come in first? Or let's try harder next time for first. So it's kind of this passive aggressiveness where you don't acknowledge the accomplishment of the child, and you push them further to becoming better. Going a bit more in depth to this, sometimes this doesn't really have to do with the child itself. Sometimes it has to do with unfulfilled dreams that the parent had. So if the parent wanted to be an athlete, if the parent wanted to pursue something they didn't during their time, during their childhood, they will project these dreams on their children, and they will push them to become more successful, because they believe that their child's success is a reflection on their success, not only as a parent, but as something that they've never done. So for example, child actors. Many child actors, their parents were actors themselves, and many times child actors will become more successful than their parents. And looking at interviews, you can see that the child actors many times will tell them that their parents pushed them and took them to many auditions and refused when the child said, I'm tired, or I want to give up. They pushed them that in the sense that they could always be better, and that their chance will come. Now, of course, these kids may have found success, but it was their parents' previous dreams that pushed them towards it. Another sign of emotionally abusive parents is that they do this comparison thing, and that falls into kind of the criticizing part that I mentioned before. I believe that they honestly don't do this from a bad place. And sometimes they will select a child and that they will emotionally abuse. Of course, I don't believe that they do this consciously. I believe they do this subconsciously, meaning that they don't understand it. And the most common example of this is that they will compare a child to their sibling. So it's a very classic kind of sibling rivalry that parents fuel sometimes. So whatever the kid does, they say like, why can you be more like your brother? Or why can you be more like your sister? Or your brother got into med school, why can't you be a doctor? Your sister got into law school, why can't you be a lawyer? Why can't you be as responsible, as mature, as kind, as generous? Like, they use all these words to describe the sibling, but they never really describe the emotionally abused child. And The thing with that is that you strip the child of their uniqueness, and they don't really know who they are. They go through life and they all automatically start comparing themselves to everyone around them because that's how they grew up. They never really had a strong sense of self. Now, another sign of emotionally abusive parents, and this falls into the therapist, the part of it, the parentification, is that the parent doesn't know boundaries. They will overshare everything with their child. They will share their sex life, the financials of the family. They will be openly criticize their partner, their spouse in front of the child. And the kid doesn't really understand where the parenting starts and where the best friend starts. So many kids that have parents that lack this sense of boundaries refer to their parents more like their best friends. They will talk to them about stuff that most other kids don't feel comfortable talking with their parents with because the parent has put down very strict boundaries. This can be because the parent is codependent, which means that they are completely enmeshed. Whatever the child feels, they feel. Whatever the child goes through, they go through. They become kind of one with the child. And because they lack boundaries, the child becomes more of a people pleaser sometimes because they're so enmeshed with their parent that they feel that they have to satisfy their needs. Now, this is not sexual. This is what I referred to in my video as emotional incest. The fact that the child responds as the spouse would respond. And one of the signs that I didn't include in my previous video, which I found fascinating because it makes sense, and bear with me and try to minimize the criticism on this, is another sign of emotionally abusive parents is when they use religion and race against the child. What do I mean? It's kind of like the boogeyman too, but it's basically trying to control your child's behavior, your child's emotions, feelings, thoughts by using religion against them, saying that this is not what a good Christian do. This is not what the Bible says. You can't do this because of that. Instead of talking with them about why what they're thinking, what they're about to do is wrong, or trying to make them understand why it's wrong, they immediately refer to their respective religion in order to understand that point. And the child doesn't really get that, I believe, during that. It doesn't really understand that during that time. It's just basically a slap on the hand. It's like, no, we don't do this. Whereas you kind of need to explain to the child why this is wrong. And when I say racial pressure and in signs of emotionally abusive parents, it's when you use your race as a way to control and to guilt your child's behavior. I'm not saying this as a racist point. It's just an example, but I've heard it. I've heard what I'm about to tell you right now. I've heard it live. Someone turning around and telling the child, you have to go to law school because my parents couldn't afford it, and you're going to be the first African-American girl that is going to be a lawyer in our family, and you have to stand strong and make us proud and make people understand that African-American women have a place in the society. And the child will never have questioned that. The child, with a proper upbringing and everything, the child will never question that they have the right to be in the society. They don't think that they have to be a lawyer in order to feel part and that they are advocating for African American women or African American in general. This is another part of emotional abuse that happens, both religious and racial, happens among many different types of races. I'm not really used to talking about racial topics, so try and not bombard me here. But what I mean is that using your race as an excuse to push a child into doing something that they may not want to do, pushing your child to do something that if they don't do it, they may feel guilty, that you are disappointing them or disappointing the entire community or the entire world or the entire women population of whatever racial group that the child belongs to. So that's another sign of emotional abuse, which I found very fascinating when reading about it. And lastly, another sign is that it's the get back technique. So when I say get back, is that the child is used kind of like the scapegoat between a very unhappy marriage or partnership. So it would be, for example, if the mother said or the father said, tell your mother this, tell your father that. tell your father that I dislike this. Tell your mother that I got angry at that. So the child is put in this situation where they are actually kind of the middle ground between the parents. Now, I said this in my previous video, I'm going to say it in this video. The relationship you have with each individual parent has nothing to do and should never have anything to do with the relationship your parents have with each other. Your parents' relationships and your individual relationship with your parents are very separate things. And this is the part where I want to bring in how emotionally abusive parents feed into future romantic relationships. If you lack boundaries, you want to control your relationship. You want to feel like you're important. You want to feel like that you are needed. So usually we'll be attracted to people that will also emotionally abuse you. We kind of go back always to this toxic environment, an environment that we don't like, even though it was toxic for us, it feels familiar. Because the parent will have another sign is, like, for example, minimizing the emotions. So because a parent has minimized your emotions by saying you're overreacting, you're too sensitive, what you're saying is not true, you'll be much more attracted to romantic partners that will also minimize your emotion and will do what has been referred to very popular lately as gaslighting, meaning that they will say that whatever you're going through is not true, that you're making things up. Now, take this video, my dear parents, as a checklist and not as something to blame. I'm not blaming you. And kids of emotionally abusive parents, don't blame your parents. Unfortunately, they are trying the best they can. You can't change what happened. You can't change the way you're growing up or you have grown up, but you can change how you will treat your children or your relationships or your friendships. So take it as a lesson and don't blame your parents because of it. Now, I hope this video helped. Don't forget to smash the subscribe button, ring that bell for your weekly Thursday videos. Give me a huge thumbs up to make Mom algorithm love me. And that's it, folks.